Today we're going to be talking about a fascinating case of two autism children whose clinical symptoms have been reversed to almost complete extent in one of the cases simply through lifestyle changes. And I didn't even know this was possible. So I found this absolutely fascinating. This was published not long ago. And I've studied autism from a genetic point of view before. I was very fascinated by this. And I do believe studying autism from genetic point of view is actually very valuable precisely so one can understand potentially what kind of modifications should be done in terms of management of the condition. But I didn't know much in terms of the capacity of what can be achieved. And this is apparently a very rare situation. So I thought I would share this with you. My name is Dr. Mikola Rashek of Neurogenomics, and let's get going. Now, we all know with autism that autism has become a form of an epidemic, if you will, because it's becoming now diagnosed extremely frequently. And not that long ago, it used to be still quite rare. So if you go back to the even second half of the 20th century, in say early 1990s, I believe that the authors were mentioning that children were diagnosed, maybe once out of 2,000 kids were diagnosed with autism. Now, later in the 90s, the diagnostic criteria will change, and as a consequence, the condition has been diagnosed more frequently. So then by, say, year 2000, I believe they mentioned it was maybe 1 out of 50 children, 150, 1 out of 150 children was diagnosed with autism. But since then, the diagnostic criteria has not been changing, while the capacity of how frequently children are being diagnosed is still on the rise continuously. And the latest data that we have is from 2020. And in 2020, it's now believed that one out of 36 children are diagnosed with autism. And that's absolutely insane number. This is like, what's going on? Clearly, something is off. We don't know what's going on. No one really knows why this is happening, but autism is on the rise. As a consequence, autism has been studied extensively. And of course, we are familiar perhaps maybe with the neurodevelopmental issues, right? Of course, we all know about the learning and social challenges, right? But it's the other spectrum of conditions that can appear in these children that I found very interesting, because it reminds me of other conditions that I also look into. So we're talking about these children have immunological dysfunction. They have gastrointestinal issues. And these days, whenever I think of those two, my mind automatically relapses to vagus nerve. If you follow my channel, you know that I study vagus nerve extensively. I'm not saying that vagus nerve is affected in autism, but that's my first relapse, is the proper function affected, because with this increase in cases, something is off, and it's either developmental, we have issues, this is perhaps where the genetics can come in, or we have issues with environmental exposure. And as you will see in a moment, what these kids could be exposed to in terms of how their symptoms could be exacerbated, it actually reminds me of the issues that could be affecting your proper vagus nerve function. So this is why I got so interested in this paper. So besides the immunological dysfunction, they have mitochondrial dysfunction issues as well. Mitochondria being, of course, that organelle that builds ATP molecules, which is your, basically think of your energy production facility inside your body. Clearly, you want this functioning to be properly in your body, right? So you don't want this to be affected. And there also can be they are not processing toxins properly. They can also be very sensitive to, and this was really surprising to me as well. I didn't even know this was a medical issue. They can be sensitive to what the authors refer to as non-native electromagnetic fields. So I thought it was, wow, I didn't even know that this is a medical field. Anyway, so then there are lifestyle factors that can also influence the condition. So what these are is, for example, poor diet, and diet is a really big part of the story. Exposure to toxins is another one. There another one is let's see. I'm trying to remember. Disruption of the gut microbiome. Right. This is something that now, when I think of gut microbiome, I immediately think of immune system as well, so that these are all interconnected, and so some of these basics lifestyle factors can be changed, and as a consequence, this is what I liked about this paper, is that the authors provided very like broad background information with lots and lots of references, scientific references, on what kind of changes have been studied in order to see how the symptoms of autism could be improved in affected children. And these are promising but non-conclusive. The reason why they phrased it like that is because these are based on clinical studies, but the reason why they say it's not necessarily conclusive is because you can't necessarily double blind everything because of the type of intervention. So meaning that you cannot really hide an intervention from the affected, say, child or a doctor, and therefore people are aware of what's going on. And once you have awareness, that can start influencing outcomes as well. This is called placebo, right? So, and placebo meaning the power of your mind, of what you want to believe, of how something could positively influence you, is so indeed powerful that you can see positive effect even if nothing is being given to you. You could just be drinking water, and if you think this is medicine, through the power of your mind, you can be positively influenced. So because you can double blind all of these situations, then the authors mentioned you couldn't necessarily determine which of these interventions are absolutely working or not. But again, diet was a big one, and I won't be able to list all of the details, but the diet one was quite interesting, hence that one I did memorize. So they were mentioning no gluten, no casein, no glutamate or very low glutamate. They also very low carbohydrates diet was being studied. I think it was called GAPS, GAPS, and also ketogenic diet. So these are the type of diets that have been looked into as a possible intervention that could help. Besides that, supplements have been studied extensively as well. And here we're talking about vitamin supplements, micronutrient supplements as well, mitochondrial function support supplements. And another one is lifestyle changes. This one was very fascinating because on top of that list of lifestyle factors was more exposure to nature. And this of course I love, because if you're a fan of my channel, you probably are getting the hint that this is probably the most common message that I propagate with my content, even though I don't necessarily say it. But really my goal to tell everyone always is spend as much time in nature for your own personal healing as possible. And I actually believe this is connected to improvement directly to your immune system. And eventually I'll be making some videos related to this concept of biophilia. So stay tuned for that. I'm gonna get around to it one day, and I'll make content with regards to our natural propensity to be in love with Mother Nature and why this is so good for you to be exposed to nature. But also they mentioned reduction to, say, artificial lights, or also improving indoor air quality. So very interesting little changes that have been studied. And then last one was therapeutic interventions. And when you hear therapeutic, you might be thinking, well, drugs, but in this case, it was more like occupational therapy, etc. Not necessarily like a pill you can take to deal with autism. So definitely modifications have been studied, but in terms of reversing autism diagnosis is actually extremely rare, but it has apparently happened. And there's, even though obviously thousands upon thousands, if not millions of kids these days are being affected, multiple or several cases have been documented in literature of reversing autism through lifestyle modifications. And one case that the authors brought up was a case where the the diagnosis was reversed, and what the children or the child had to undergo was again big change to diet, use of probiotics, also use or using micronutrient support and antimicrobials. And again, whenever I hear all of this, I automatically relapse to, this sounds to me like important support of the immune system, right? So it starts to look to me like, you know what, all immune system might be quite out of whack, and as one of the components of maybe what's causing all of this. Because as you can see from what I'm listing, oftentimes these children unfortunately are extremely sensitive. They're just simply not capable of processing environmental cues that you would expect from a normal individual. And this reminds me, as I mentioned, this reminds me of certain conditions such as chronic fatigue syndrome. We made videos on this topic, but also even now, um, long COVID as well. And again, I'm not comparing these, but some of their interventions, like I've been interacting with quite a few people who are now facing long COVID. This is, unfortunately, I hear more and more people are suffering from long COVID, and some of the people I had a chance to interact with have been extremely affected to a point where, I mean, it's just heartbreaking. Where people who were completely normal ended up being debilitated, like they can't have a normal life anymore, and it took months and months of intervention. And a lot of the times it was indeed through a lot of diet changes or changes to lots of supplements use as well. And the conditions have improved. This is why it triggers my mind as to what might be happening here. I've also been interacting with a number of people who provide this type of support. I gotta tell you, there are always women. It seems that only women are interested in building this type of knowledge. And whenever they contact me, they already know I'm a scientist, which is kind of great because they always come to me with a scientific background knowledge in order to explain their wisdom of what they've learned. And so when I heard of this case and the type of very holistic approach into how these children had to be helped, it reminded me of these women sharing the stories of how they were helping people either with terms of long COVID or chronic fatigue syndrome, which was very multifaceted approach, and exposure to toxins or what kind of diet individuals were on was very, very big. This is at least from my memory, right? All right, so now let's get into this case. So this was a case where the father was quite an older age. He was in his 50s, and this was an in vitro fertilization of a donor egg, and then a surrogate mother was used in order to deliver two girls. Now, clearly, this automatically will imply that there's fertilization or fertility issues were being involved here. And the reason why I just simply bring that up is because that issue in terms of fertility also, at least based on my vague understanding, also appears to be on the rise in our population. It's sort of concurrent in terms of what we're seeing in terms of fertility issues, as well as how the autism is also being on the rise. So Yeah, again, there's that link here. And the two girls that were born right at the start of pandemic in January 2020, and soon after, within 3 to I believe 6 months, they had some vaccinations. The rest of the vaccinations that these girls were exposed to were delayed till 14 months because of the pandemic. Between these two vaccination regimens, the parents started to notice symptoms that there's something off. The girls were not as responsive as you would expect. There was a clear delay in terms of expected achievement of growth for these children. They were not responding to the social cues. They had also health issues, gastrointestinal issues, and so on. But what is really interesting, and this is probably not something you're going to be able to see frequently mentioned in a publication, is that there was a massive increase, according to the parents, in worsening of symptoms after that second round of vaccinations at their age of 14 months. Especially for one of the girls, she had a huge language loss capacity. So really, really big. Now, of course, why do I mention this? Because it sounds controversial. And the reason why I want to mention this is because, look, there's been tons of studies looking into the possible links between vaccines and autism, and apparently no links have ever been discovered. And you know what? This actually can make sense to me. In this situation, it might not be the vaccines that actually worsen the things, but really the immunological response that vaccines were inducing. And the reason why I mention this is because when you vaccinate with any vaccines, it's a specific immunological programming that you're inducing. And, and this immunologic programming can be insanely powerful. But what a lot of people don't understand is that we have an amazing or tremendous knowledge gap still. I think a lot of people are under the influence that we know everything, so we know what we're doing. And the reality is, no, we don't. We don't. And this became very obvious, I think, during the pandemic with the mRNA vaccines. And one of the most obvious knowledge gaps that I can refer you to, so that this sounds really obvious, is that, for example, we don't really know what is a proper dose of vaccines. When we use vaccines, we dose with a specific amount in order to make sure that there's a measurable immunological response, but measurable in a type of quality that satisfies us from a scientific point of view, without truly understanding whether that kind of immunological response is properly safe or not, and what would be the long-term lasting consequences. And we've learned that and seen this during the pandemic, because of the fact that basically it starts to appear to us that anyone who has received mRNA vaccines are now very likely to start producing IgG4 antibodies. I've done many videos on IgG4 antibodies. These are specific type of antibodies that are typically on the rise in an individual if an antigen is exposed too much to the immune system. Meaning, whatever we're telling with the vaccine for our immune system to start producing antibodies to, with those vaccines, we presented it too much to the people. So again, you can see those issues. We don't know what is the ideal dose. And if without that knowledge, if an individual has certain, say, biological issues that make it challenging to properly immunologically respond to a vaccine or basically an antigen, you could potentially have issues. So if the dose wasn't right for these girls because of the complications they were already being born with, you can see how the immunological response from the vaccine might have exacerbated the problems. So you can see the conundrum there. You can easily mention, yeah, sure, vaccines do not cause problems in terms of autism, but the immunological response if it's not appropriate due to a variety of biological factors. That could be a problem as well. All right, so then parents, as I mentioned, clearly noticed that, and then at the age of 20 months, basically, these two girls were diagnosed with autism spectrum disorder level 3, requiring extreme intervention. And so what happened then? Basically, the whole process took about 2 years. These parents were extremely committed in being able to help their girls, and they hired autism specialist coach. And the first thing that they did is they studied on a concept that they learned from the coach on, I think it was called total allostatic load. And this basically is a concept that claims that through variety of stressors, you can basically result in or induce something like a chronic disease. So what are we talking about here? So it's like a little exposure from this angle and a little bit of exposure, stressor from this angle, and all of it together can start accumulating into an affected individual, including a child, say producing too much inflammatory cytokines or cortisol, and as a consequence, the individual ends up with having a chronic condition. And one of the very first things that the parents really focused on was diet change. And this, as I mentioned, is a very big theme of the story. So again, no gluten, no casein, no glutamate, and also very low sugar and nothing artificial, nothing processed. Everything apparently was organic. Everything was made homemade, and basically diet was really big factor. They also did large intervention in terms of supplements. This is an interesting component here. So the reason why is because they use genetic testing for guidance in terms of what would be the ideal way to supplement. And I gotta tell you, this is for me, this was the largest limitation of the paper. And the reason why is because the type of the type of supplements you should be using based on your genetics, it's, as far as I understand, and this is just my background knowledge, it's not necessarily well verified yet. Because you have to understand that just because something was published in scientific literature, that doesn't make it actually real. And there's a lot of mutations that have been published that have been proposed to be linked to specific needs of a supplement, but that's not necessarily it's not necessarily been verified clinically. And unlike, say, pharmacogenetics, something that I've studied a lot and was very familiar with. So with pharmacogenetics, it's a very different story, because there are pharmacogenetic tests that have indeed been clinically verified, meaning that if you find a specific mutation, you can be certain that this mutation will mean you will have altered, say, for example, metabolism, and you will no longer process a specific drug. So that's pharmacogenetics. Nutrigenetics or nutrigenomics, they're used interchangeably, even though they don't mean the same thing. One means how do your genetics influence processing of either a medication or a specific food you eat, and the other one means how the food you eat might influence genetic responses of your body, including you as a host, as well as, say, your bacteria. And if I'm not telling you which one is which, that's simply because I don't remember at the moment. But in terms of nutrigenetics, that hasn't necessarily been linked, not been clinically verified. And the reason why is because no one wants to put millions and millions and millions of dollars in order to verify this. But nevertheless, this type of information was being used extensively by these by experts that were involved here in terms of guiding the supplements. And to me, this is probably the largest limitation of this paper, because in my opinion, the mutations that were used as a guidance as to what kind of supplements should be used should have been listed in this paper. And the reason why is because this is how we need to build this pool of knowledge in terms of understanding, hey, which mutations, when you see them based on past information or published scientific information, are indeed true and therefore responsive to the supplements. That would have been very nice in my opinion. Nevertheless, there was, as I mentioned, there was heavy supplementation used. They also used a variety of experts, such as osteopath, who was working with making sure that the neurosensory reflexes are being improved in these girls. Of course, pediatricians were involved. So a number of experts were being involved. And basically, the authors mentioned that the specific measuring criteria was being used. Autism treatment evaluation checklist, I think is what it was called. Apparently, it's very sensitive in order to determine whether the autism spectrum disorder is improving or not. And there was phenomenal improvement overall in these two girls over the 2 years span time, or basically a year and a half. One of the girls went from something like 76 score to say 32, and the other girl went from 40 something, let's say 45, 46, all the way down to 4. So basically almost nothing. So these girls went from very, say, severe cases to now, at least one of them was basically normal functioning girl. There was perhaps still a repetitive speech pattern. One of the girls with a still higher score still had certain social challenges, but absolutely amazing results. And they even mentioned that this, for one of these girls, this looked more like a miracle. Absolutely fascinating, because it shows you how environmental interventions, and again, there's diet was a big one, and supplements were big ones. And when I think of diet and when I think of these supplements, the first thing I go to is, of course, in terms of improvement of their overall immune responses, even though the article did not touch on that at all. Now, the only thing that the authors mentioned is like, listen, the reason why all the experts involved in this case were mentioning the reason why this worked so incredibly effectively for these girls is because of the fact that these parents were so heavy duty involved in making sure that these girls can get the best treatment. They were very invested, and they listened to all of their advice. But of course, as you can, the authors as mentioned, as you can see, because of the number of interventions, this would be very expensive. It might not be achievable for every parent, and even they mentioned even the type of interventions used might not simply be available to every parent, even if they wish they could do it. And that might even include the quality of nutrition and food. Not everyone might have access to all the organic food, for example, that the parents were using in this situation. But basically, the take-home message is that through this very invested, holistic approach, there was a huge improvement in these girls. So super welcome and fascinating story. I really hope this will open the doors to further studies into how can we start remedying this situation with this massive increase of autism on the rise in our population. All right, I'm gonna wrap it up here. It took me a little longer than I expected, but please leave a comment. Let me know what you think as well. Please subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. Please hit that like. YouTube loves all of these elements, and I gotta be honest, so do I. And And then also please check out our private channel, Patreon account, where we post additional stuff that does not make it to the YouTube. And I look forward to seeing you in another installment. Bye, everyone.